Dublin Bible Talks. I'm Cameron Jones. Disappointment with leaders is common across people, cultures and through history. But in the midst of a leadership crisis, where does God look for a leader? And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. Friends, one of the things that is pretty common in human experience and in human history is dissatisfaction with leaders. I suspect that one of the reasons we like democracy so much is because we like getting rid of leaders so much. But we quite like the risk-free and fairly bloodless method of doing that democracy provides. If we think about it, can we really think that democracy is the best possible method of getting the most intelligent leader or the wisest leader? No, we like democracy so much because when we're tired of a leader, we can vote them out. We vote people in because we think they'll do a better job than the last person. And then after a couple of years, we want the right to change our minds and replace that leader without having a violent revolution and bloodshed. But do you see the embedded problem? Or do you see embedded into this system an expectation? An expectation of better leadership than we actually receive. We are constantly disappointed because we always expect something better. We hope election after election that the change comes or the wake-up call has been given that will bring the leadership that we hope for. The leadership that will reward hard work and care for the needy. The leadership that will oppose the arrogant and recognise the humble. The leadership that will help the country prosper so that it can take its proper place on the world stage. 1 Samuel is a book about leadership, looking for a leader for God's people. And so we go back to around 1050 BC, to a time where God's people had no continuous leadership, a time of the judges. And without such leadership, the people fell again and again away from the God who had brought them out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And then as they disobeyed, this God would punish them, and they would be oppressed by the nations who were in the land that he had given them, but they had not cleared out, like God had commanded them to do. And each time they were punished, they would return to God and they would call out to him, and he, remembering his promises to them, would raise up a new leader, a judge who would lead them into victory and make things right. And then that judge would die and the people would forget and the cycle would begin all over again. And if you turn back a couple of pages to the end of Judges, to Judges chapter 21, verse 25, you can see how that period of history is going. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes, and not really paying any attention to God. God's people need a leader who will not fail. They need a king. On the very next page in our English Bibles, we have the story of Ruth. It's a beautiful love story set in the time of the Judges, but it's much more than a simple love story. If you look at the chapter 4 of Ruth, verse 17, we get to the end of the story of this woman who is married to Boaz, the father of Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. The sweet story of Ruth is in the Bible because it reveals a part of God's plan to rule his people by the king he has appointed. So now we understand the background, we understand the situation. Israel is, and listen closely to these key words, Israel is hopeless, desolate, barren, unproductive, and sad, waiting for God to remember them. So with that in mind, let's work through this account scene by scene and see how God begins to provide a leader for his people. But before we do that, where would you start if you were God? Where would you start looking for a king? Well, let's have a look at where God starts. Verse 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 1. God starts with a man from Ramathaim or Ramah, from the hill country of Ephraim. Now, if you don't recognize that place, don't be too embarrassed. It's a little backwater town. That's where our narrator focuses our attention. A man named Elkanah and his family. He's a man who has two wives, Hannah and Peninnah has children, and Hannah is childless. Look in verse 3. You see that this man called Elkanah was a faithful Israelite. Every year he would take his family to Shiloh. That's the place where the tabernacle was set up back in Joshua's day, Joshua chapter 18. It's the tent in which God has chosen to dwell with his people, and that's located at this place called Shiloh. They went there as God had told them in the Old Testament law to give thanks and to make sacrifices to atone for their sins. And verse 3, we see that they did that year after year. They were consistent in their obedience. And we're also introduced to some more characters, the high priest Eli and his sons Phinehas and Hophni in verse 3. Those two, Phinehas and Hophni, we find out in the following chapters, are not the leaders that they should be. And as this family went to sacrifice, Elkanah would distribute portions to his wives. And we find out that it is Hannah that he loves, verse 5. Hannah is probably his first wife, but we hear again of the great tragedy of Hannah's life at the end of verse 5. The Lord had closed her womb. And we're left in no doubt as to the cause of this sad situation. It is the Lord who had closed her womb. It's even repeated in the next verse by our narrator, so we can't miss it. We can't miss that the great desire of Hannah's life is denied her by the Lord. And as if that was not bad enough, this sad woman Hannah has a rival. Did you see that in verse 6? Her rival, Peninnah, probably married by Elkanah in order to produce children, in order to continue his family line. And this second wife, she's really productive. And Hannah's rival, Peninnah, provokes her to irritate her. You see that in the second half of verse 6? Where every time they go to the temple with their thank offerings, year after year, you can almost hear Peninnah taunting. What are you doing, Hannah? Childless Hannah. What have you got to thank God for, sad, lonely Hannah, when the thing you desire most, he will not give you? If you look at verse 7 of chapter 1 of Samuel, you see that our narrator wants us to feel the seemingly endless nature of this woman's taunts. This went on year after year, taunting until poor Hannah is so distraught she can't even eat. And some of us might understand the nature of this pain. We might not have a Peninnah, but we feel the sadness of it, the emptiness of it, where even the sound of a child's laughter, with all of its beauty, can be a thing of great pain. But we can't let our own pain distract us, because this story is actually a part of God's big plan. Remember again where we are in the story of the Bible. Hannah is like Israel, a nation that is empty and barren with no king, and everyone does as they see fit. A nation waiting for a leader from God. In verse 8, we find Elkanah is a man who loves his wife Hannah, and he tries to comfort her, perhaps clumsily, but he sees what is happening to the wife that he loves, and he goes to her in verse 8, "Why are you weeping? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" I mean, he's really grasping at straws, isn't he? but he does it for his beloved wife. But he can't make things right. And this happens year after year. Poor sad Hannah, taunted by her rival, and with a husband who cannot comfort her. And so we come to the second scene, verses 9 to 18. It's a cry to God. In one particular year, provoked to tears, unable to eat, Hannah rises from the table and goes out to the house of God where old Eli is sitting. And Hannah is weeping in the temple and pouring out her soul to God. You see it in verse 10, in bitterness of soul she wept. Verse 11, in misery. Verse 15, deeply troubled. Verse 16, her anguish and her grief. She wept and she prayed. See how those two things go together in Hannah's life. She casts her anxieties on the Lord. And in her pain she approaches the Lord. Hannah goes to the very God who had closed her womb, and she pours out her pain to him. Verse 11, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and do not forget your servant. Note what she asks. She asks God to remember her, that he not forget her. She asks the Lord to give her a son, and promises that as God does not forget her, she will not forget God. So she commits her son to the Lord's service as a Nazirite is the official term for it in the Old Testament law, and you can find that written up in Numbers chapter 6. And as she bears out her soul to God, old Eli the priest is sitting there, and he sees her in verse 12, and perhaps in a hint of what's been going on in the tabernacle in those days, he assumes that she's drunk, verse 13. He sees a woman, unstable, in tears, moving her lips without speaking. Hannah tells her story, and then Eli replies with the words that maybe should have been better coming from his mouth at first. Verse 17, he says to her, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked him. Eli himself knows who is in control, and the comfort he offers is the knowledge of the God who may grant requests like Hannah has made, but who certainly can give the peace to the anguished. So this scene ends with Hannah at peace in verse 18. She goes and she eats. Her face is no longer downcast. Having entrusted herself to the Lord, she is given rest by him. And so we come to the third scene. God remembers, verses 19 to 23. In verse 19, the family return to their home in Ramah. And in time, Elkanah sleeps with Hannah, and look at what the words that are used are in verse 19, the second half of verse 19. The Lord remembered her. We should not read that thinking that God had forgotten, but that he looked on her with favour. This poor, sad, childless woman from a backwater town in the hills of Israel, a nation as sad and poor and barren as Hannah is herself, this woman is remembered by God. God remembers her, and he opens the womb that he had closed, and she has a child, and his name is Samuel, which means asked of God. She had asked, and God remembered her. And where there was barrenness, God created fertility. And so we come to the fourth scene, verses 24 to 28, given to the Lord's work. In the following years, Hannah does not join the family going to the tabernacle, but she does remember her promise. And so, when she weaned her son to Samuel, and from what we know of the customs of the time, Samuel's probably about 3 years of age. Verse 24, she takes the boy, young as he is, and presents him in fulfillment of her promise. And she offers what is, if you have a look at the laws of the Old Testament, a very generous thank offering to the Lord, the one who remembered her. So how are we to understand this little story that we find recorded of an event that happened so long ago? Recorded in this book, which we believe is God's word even to us today. Well, maybe we can look at Elkanah, a man of admirable love for a sad wife. He loves her. He expresses that love. He speaks words to try and comfort her. Or maybe we can learn from Penina and learn from her how hurtful words can be. And in that we're reminded of the evil nature of sin, that one need not hit someone in order to abuse them. But actually the focus of our story is surely Hannah. Poor childless Hannah, provoked to weeping and unable to eat, who turns to the Almighty God and receives relief, who turns not to anger, but to plead to God for him to remember her in his mercy. Well, friends, they are all great lessons to learn, and if we learn those lessons from this passage, we have not lost anything. No, we have gained knowledge for life under God. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 7 says, "Cast all your anxiety upon him because he cares for you." But friends, that's not all that's happening here. Because, of course, some might be tempted to see this passage as a kind of promise to us, who might dearly love a child ourselves, that as Hannah was given a child, so God will give a child to me as well. As if a deal could be made with God, some kind of exchange. If you do this for me, God, then I'll do that for you. But friends, we can't do that with this passage. It would go a long way beyond what is recorded here. It would go a long way beyond why it's recorded here. Even looking at the passage itself, we can't take Hannah's experience and make it true for every person who desires a child. This passage gives us no reason to think that Hannah was the most pathetic woman in all of Israel. It gives us no reason to think that she was the most deserving of pity in all of Israel. I mean, at least she had a godly husband who loved her. I'm sure there were many in Israel who didn't even have that. We certainly can't think she was the only woman in Israel unable to have a child, not any more than we could think that she was the only one who begged God to remember her. And neither can we think that she was the only woman in all of Israel who tried to make a vow to God. I mean, the text doesn't give us any reason to think any of those things, and if not then certainly not now. And if we tried to apply the passage in this way, we'd actually be missing the main point of the passage. We'd be taking out of its place in the great plan of God to save all people. It would miss out the most wonderful thing that this account so long ago reveals to us. Friends, to understand what's happening here, we need to remember where we begin the story, the context of Israel's history from those scenes. Remember God's chosen people, Israel? Uh, he's promised that he will bless all nations through them. But at the moment, they have no king. At the moment, that nation that is supposed to be the blessing to all nations, the judges haven't established a continual devotion to God. The people need a leader from God. What kind of leader will God provide? That's the big question that needs an answer as we come to this passage. How will God bring this leader? How will God announce his king? Well, God's answer begins where we would never have thought to begin looking. He begins with a small backwater town in Israel. He begins with a poor, sad woman who can't have a child. He begins with a woman who is remembered by him with favour. And through this woman, and through in giving her a child, God turns the world upside down. And Hannah realizes this with prophetic insight, and she sings a song. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. It's a hymn of response and of prophecy. We don't have time to deal with this in detail, and in fact we will have another look at this again as we come towards Christmas. But notice the references to the Lord who turns the world upside down in her song. Verses 1 and 2 is the shout of the one who is restored, and she shouts to God, the rock, the solid one, the unique God. In verse 3, those who speak like this, Penina, I think, is in mind, they are silenced. In verse 4 to 8, the bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who were hungry hunger no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honour. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. Upon them he has set the world. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder against them from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. The world is turned upside down by God. First are last, and last are first. Strength and leadership are found in the Lord. Everything else is futile. The second half of verse 10, remember this before the king. Hannah has God-given insight here. That is, all of her experience is about what? He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed one. This end of this song leaves us in no doubt about what the true significance of the birth of this boy Samuel is. He is the man who is going to announce God's king. Now, the big question now is how this helps us understand anything that's relevant to us today. Now, as we read this account, I wonder if you were reminded of another birth. Because years and years after this event, after another period of Israel's barrenness, 400 years in which God had not spoken by a prophet, some are still waiting for the promised king. And in Luke chapter 1, verse 15 and following, we have a story of another woman who doesn't have a child, and her husband, and they're both very old. This time the husband himself is a priest, and we find him in the temple. And an angel appeared to that husband, whose name was Zechariah, telling him that his wife Elizabeth is going to have a child, and he is to be a Nazirite, just like Hannah's son Samuel is. And Elizabeth and Zechariah, their child, will prepare the people for the king's arrival. The child of Zechariah and Elizabeth, his name is John. The God who remembers in 1 Samuel is the God who remembers in Luke's account of Jesus' birth. And his remembering is the remembering of his promises made throughout the Old Testament. They are finally fulfilled by the man that John the Baptist introduced. He introduced him saying, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight paths for him." And you might remember a story of another young woman, a relative of Elizabeth, with another amazing birth story in a backwater town in Israel. This young woman, Mary, she sings a song. It begins with exactly the same words as Hannah begins her song. a song about a God who remembers, who is mindful of her humble state. He remembers the lowly. He is merciful. He takes rulers and deposes them, but lifts up the humble. He fills the hungry with good things, but the rich go away empty. Luke records for us in chapter 1, verse 55, He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, even as he said to our fathers. The book of 1 Samuel and the account of Samuel's birth reveals to us the God who meets us at our very deepest need. It shows us the God who turns the world upside down in order to rescue us. It points us to John the Baptist, who will introduce the great Saviour, Jesus. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks. That's bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks.